We're looking at Nehemiah chapters 3 and 4 as we continue to explore this Old Testament book with such an up-to-date message for us. A few years ago, a man named Stephen Sigmund was trying to get his name in the Guinness Book of World Records. His attempt went up in smoke. Using a contraption that looked like an air filter for a car, Sigmund managed to smoke 800 cigarettes at one time. Only later did he discover that Guinness no longer accepts these kinds of accomplishments. People like to hear their name mentioned in a positive way. And Nehemiah 3 is basically a list of people who achieved some major accomplishments. Alongside the medal winners, there are a few who are listed because they never joined the team. And it's interesting that Nehemiah is not mentioned. I think he wanted to keep the attention on others. At first glance, Nehemiah 3 looks dry. One writer refers to it as a colourless memorandum of assignments. Have you heard the quip, "I like work, it fascinates me. I can sit and look at it for hours"? Well, when it comes to the work of the Lord, there is no place for sitting on the couch and watching award ceremonies. As we see in this chapter, the wall workers accomplished an incredible task and smashed a world record for teamwork. Nehemiah was able to build his team around a central rallying point. He pointed them to the purpose of the work, the glory of God. They were not just working on walls, they were worshipping their worthy God. It all happened because the workers were upset about the conditions of the city and disgraced in the presence of their enemies. They longed for God's city to regain its splendor and God to get the credit. The purpose of all ministry and life itself is the glory of God. Look at verse 1. Eliashib the high priest and his fellow priests went to work and rebuilt the sheep gate. They dedicated it and set its doors in place. It's no accident that the list starts at the sheep gate. It's another way of saying put God first. Close to the wall's northeast corner, this gate provided easy access to the temple and was given this name because of all the sheep that entered through it to be sacrificed. So by beginning here, Nehemiah is establishing that their relationship with God was central. This was the most important place to start. And they had a time of dedication right at the beginning of the construction project. We must make sure we are dedicated to God before we begin working for Him. This is critical. Don't make the mistake of focusing so much on the work or the task that you forget God Himself. God is not impressed with our labour. He wants our heart. That's why worship must always precede work for God. Now, I see 6 principles from chapter 3 that will help each of us to become God's team and work well with others. We will then move into chapter 4 because one thing can stop us in our tracks as we seek to serve God, and that's discouragement. And we need to get a handle on how to cope with it because it's inevitable. And Nehemiah can show us the way. So let's start with the 6 principles for teamwork. Number 1, leaders must set the example. We see this in verse 1. If anybody in the city should have been busy with the work, it was the priests, because God's reputation was at stake. And the high priest had no hesitation using his consecrated hands to swing a hammer or push a wheelbarrow. Sad to say, Eliashib did not remain true to his calling and later partnered with the enemy to create some serious problems for Nehemiah. And this serves as a good reminder to us. It's not as important how we begin a project, it's how we finish that counts. Some people who enthusiastically begin a job or a ministry may drop out or even turn against it for one reason or another. Secondly, God uses all kinds of people. Look at verse 8. Uzziel, son of Harhaiah, one of the goldsmiths, repaired the next section. And Hananiah, one of the perfume makers, made repairs next to that. The Lord didn't need 1,000 masons and carpenters to rebuild the wall. He needed ordinary people who were willing to work. There was a place for everyone and a job for everyone to do. No one can do everything, but everyone can do something. But some people will not work. That's principle number 3 that we must note. And we see this in verse 5. The next section was repaired by the men of Tekoa, but their nobles would not put their shoulders to the work under their supervisors. Tekoa was a town about 11 miles from Jerusalem, and while some of the people commuted to the job site, the nobles from Tekoa called in sick. Actually, the text says that they refused to participate in the work of God because they didn't want to follow orders. They were too proud to submit themselves to the supervisors of the job. They were too important to get their hands dirty. Anyone listening who refuses to roll up their sleeves and work, feeling like you are too important to spend time with a hurting person, teach Sunday school, or help pour concrete. Some of the happiest Christians I know are those who are serving in their area of giftedness. On the other hand, some of the grumpiest Christians I know are those who are pew potatoes and are not willing to put their shoulder to the work. Fourthly, some do more work. In every church and in any project, there will always be some who are slack in their serving. But at the same time, there will always be those who do more work than others. Remember the men from Tekoa. In verse 5, we read that they finished their section of the wall, even though their nobles didn't help at all. And drop down to verse 27. Next to them, the men of Tekoa repaired another section. Refusing to follow the bad example of their leaders, these workers went the extra mile. I picture them coming up to Nehemiah and telling him that they finished their job. And Nehemiah asked them if they wanted another section, and they said, "Bring it on." The men of Binnui did the same thing in verses 18 and 24. Another man named Meshullam completed one part and then repaired an additional section. In verse 21, Meremoth, son of Uriah, the son of Hakoz, repaired another section from the entrance of Eliashib's house to the end of it. After he finished his assignment, he worked on the wall in front of his neighbour's house. So when he was done shoveling his sidewalk, he moved down the street to his neighbour's drifted driveway. As long as there is work to be done in God's kingdom, there's work for us to do. Number 5, some work with passion. In this entire chapter, there is only one man mentioned who worked zealously. Look at verse 20. Next to him, Baruch, son of Zabiah, zealously repaired another section. Because in 4:6 we read that the people worked with all their heart. Everyone was working hard, but in a crowd of committed construction workers, Baruch stood out from the rest. We need people like him who will say, I don't really care what others are doing, I'm going to do my very best. Anyone else want to be like Baruch? Are we willing to go the extra mile and burn with zeal and passion in our service? Are we tired of just going through the motions? Are we ready to get fired up and work? Let's kick it up a notch. If the truth were known, most all of us could do a lot more with a lot more passion than what we're doing right now. And sixthly, some work as families. The final principle from this great passage is that some people worked as families, either on a section in front of their home or in another section away from their neighbourhood. At least 6 different workers plus an unknown number of priests repaired the portions of the wall that were nearest to their own houses. If all of us would follow this example, our neighbourhoods would look differently. Look at your neighbours as your mission field. Befriend them, serve them, pray for them. I challenge each of us to identify 5 neighbours and commit to do 3 things. Pray, care, share. As we pray for them, God will give us opportunities to care for their needs, which will open avenues to share the good news. We are called to start at home, but we're not supposed to stay there. In verse 3, the fish gate was rebuilt by the sons of Hassanah, and in verse 12, the daughters of Shallum worked on the wall. As families, we have the opportunity to be used in our neighbourhoods and community. So instead of just looking at what we can do as an individual, think creatively about how we can include our entire family in the joyful task of kingdom building. Like athletes on the relay team, everyone has to do their part if they want to win a medal. So do we see this? Nehemiah is all about motivating people to build some broken down walls, but of course there's more to it than that. God wants our lives, which at times are broken down walls and not strong and bringing security. As a church, we surely want to be a team of people, helping to restore people's lives. And in chapter 3, it outlines some key principles on how to work together, how to move as a team of people for the good of one another. But we need to move straight into chapter 4, because at times we get discouraged as we work for the Lord. It's a big problem, and this chapter can help us address it. Are you familiar with Murphy's Law? The original Murphy was an engineer who conducted an experiment to test human acceleration tolerances. Unfortunately for him, he installed 16 motion sensors the wrong way up, leading to the now famous quotation, "If anything can go wrong, it will." I guess it's also often true, if anything can't go wrong, it will anyway. Coming to Nehemiah 4, everything seems to be going wrong all at once. And Mr. Murphy shows up and reminds Nehemiah that when everything seems to be going well, you've obviously overlooked something. Did you know that there is a pandemic sweeping the country today? It can be just as deadly as the most dreaded virus known to man. It's called discouragement. We're going to focus on both the causes and cures for discouragement. Let's begin by looking at the causes. There are two main types of discouragement. One set of problems come to us from the outside. The other set attacks us on the inside. Look at the external causes. Getting the work started on the wall was a major achievement, but keeping the workers working proved to be a much tougher assignment. Someone has said that exhilaration is that feeling you get just after a great idea hits you and right before you realize what's wrong with it. Where God is at work, the enemy also is at work. Rebuilding the wall of Jerusalem was certainly no exception. When people take kingdom priorities seriously, Satan stirs up agitators to block the work of God. And these enemies use two types of external forces. The first was ridicule. We see this in verse 1. When Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall, he became angry and was greatly incensed. He ridiculed the Jews. Sanballat and his cronies had begun to ridicule the workers even before the work had started. They mocked and ridiculed us. Here he is making a speech before the army of Samaria, intensifying the power of ridicule. In verse 3, it was Tobiah's turn to ridicule the workers when he tried out a joke on them. What they are building, if even a fox climbed up on it, he would break down their wall of stones. Whenever we attempt to get involved in the work of God, we will always face ridicule. Expect it and don't stop working. The second cause of their external discouragement was repression. The enemies have moved from being bothered by the Jews to being very angry. They all plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and stir up trouble against it. God's people sometimes have difficulty working together, but the people of the world have no problem uniting in opposition to the work of the Lord. Pressures from without often create problems within. Opposition outside the ranks can lead to depression on the inside. The first cause of internal discouragement was fatigue. Verse 10 reads, "Meanwhile the people in Judah said, 'The strength of the laborers is giving out.'" Simply put, the workers were tired. When you're physically drained, it is very easy to become discouraged at the slightest problem. It's also interesting to notice when the workers became fatigued and discouraged. Verse 6 says that the wall was built to half its height. Many times when we start a new project, the first half goes quickly because we're excited about accomplishing the goal. But when the newness wears off and the work becomes routine and boring, then it's easy to become fatigued. And when tired, it's easy to become discouraged and begin to think that we will never finish the job. We can't rebuild the wall. And they were ready to throw in the towel. These are the same people who were described as those who worked with all their heart. If you're feeling fatigued, watch out. Tiredness can lead to discouragement. We just can't burn the candle at both ends on a long-term basis. Sometimes the most spiritual thing to do is to go to bed. So, we can get fatigued and that leads to discouragement. The second thing that can happen is that we can get frustrated. Verse 10 continues by saying that there is so much rubble that they can't rebuild the wall. They become discouraged because they were so aggravated with the situation. I am sure that they were encountering old broken rocks, dirt and dried out mortar. This junk was everywhere and it was frustrating. Just as they lost sight of their goal, so today we can lose sight of our goal when we have too much rubbish in our lives. I don't know what the rubble is in your life, but it may be television, it might be a possession you're holding on to, or even an unhealthy relationship. Is there a sin you've been playing around with too long? Do you have a drinking problem? Or are you involved in some other kind of entanglement that is tripping you up? Something you've been doing in secret that you think no one else knows about. As the writer to the Hebrews says, throw it off so you don't get tripped up. And still another cause of discouragement is fear. The enemies of the Lord's work had struck fear into the hearts of God's people, and they felt like giving up. Remember what they said? We cannot rebuild the walls. Did you notice who gets afraid the quickest? Then the Jews who lived near them came and told us 10 times over, wherever you turn, they will attack us. Those most affected by fear are those who live near pessimistic people. If you want to limit the depressing thoughts that bring fear into your life, then it's best not to hang around with negative people. It's like the old saying, if you're going to soar with the eagles, you can't run around with the turkeys. Fear puts us in a frame of mind where we can not only become discouraged, we can also be deceived. I don't want to spoil the ending, but the enemies never do attack Jerusalem. So now we know some of the causes of discouragement. Ridicule and repression can lead to fatigue, frustration, and fear. And let me tell you that discouragement is a curable disease. And this is good news. We don't have to live with a chronic condition anymore. Look briefly at 3 cures for discouragement. The first cure is to request God's help. I love the story of the man was being pursued by a roaring, hungry lion, feeling the beast's hot breath on his neck and knowing his time was short, he broke out in a prayer as he ran like crazy. "Oh Lord, please make this lion a Christian. Please make him a Christian." Within seconds, the frightened man noticed that the lion had stopped chasing him. When he looked behind him, he found the lion kneeling and moving his lips in obvious prayer. Greatly relieved at this turn of events, he got close enough to the lion to hear him pray. "And bless, O Lord, this food which I am about to receive." Well, this was quite a prayer. He wasn't praying for his enemies to become believers, but instead for God to judge them. This prayer was not nice, but it was understandable and honest. He knew that the enemies were really fighting against God, and so he asked God to deal with them. He didn't give lectures to the workers, organise raiding parties against the enemies, or create propaganda campaigns to put a different spin on things. Here's the principle we can learn from Nehemiah. When people talk against you, don't talk back. Talk to God. Verse 9 tells us that they prayed to God and posted a guard. When their enemies started talking, Nehemiah continued to pray, and the people continued to work. Request God's help. And the second cure is to reorganize our priorities. Nehemiah said, "Therefore, I stationed some of the people behind the lowest point of the wall at the exposed places, posting them by families with their swords, spears, and bows." When we're discouraged, one of the things we can do is to reorganize our priorities. We can look at our life. We can adopt a change in approach instead of becoming so discouraged that we quit. Do you have a problem in your marriage? If so, don't bail out on your spouse. Change your approach. Adopt a new attitude. Get some help. Do you have a problem in your job? Don't give up. Change your priorities. Do you have a problem in your walk with God? Don't stop following Jesus. Reorganize your schedule so you can meet with him on a regular basis. Plug into a small group. Don't be overcome by discouragement. Do something about it. The third thing we can do is to remember who God is. Verse 10 was true. The people could not rebuild the wall on their own. They needed to remember God and what he had promised. It's easy to forget God when things are tough. I need to be reminded that he is always there for me. How do you remember the Lord? By remembering that he will always be there for you. We're to remember that he is great and awesome. God is more than able to deal with our discouragement. So when we're down, turn our attention from our discouragement to the one who is able to do something about it. God has been faithful to us in the past. He is faithful to us today. And he has promised to be faithful to us in the future. Our God is great and awesome. Remember him. The people complained about all the rubble. Question: wasn't the rubble there in the beginning? Yes, it was. The difference was that when they started the project, they were focused on God and his character. Now they had become rubble gazers. If we focus on all the junk in our life and the lives of others, we will become discouraged. Let's determine to be God gazers instead of rubble gazers. At the time it was completed in 1937. America's Golden Gate Bridge was the longest suspension bridge in the world. There were few safety devices. When half completed, they made changes. They reorganized and built the largest net ever made and attached it under the area where the men were working. Was it worth the cost and time it took to do this? Ask the 10 men who fell into it without being injured. The work was completed in 3/4 the time because the workers no longer lived in fear of falling. God's great net of security spans this globe, no matter where we live. No matter what we've done, no matter how discouraged we've been, he has stretched out his everlasting arms beneath us. As a result, we can live and work freely and without fear, knowing that we are protected, safe, and secure. Discouragement can be defeated as we request his help, reorganize our priorities, and remember who he is. Let's underline that request his help, reorganize our priorities, and remember who he is as we work together for the Lord.